I remember it must have been about 20 years ago when I first noticed what might be described as a type of misandry, or at least a negative attitude towards men. And I'm not sure if that coincides with me just becoming more cognizant of the world or a trend that hadn't existed prior. I mean, certainly in the 80s, when I was a child, I couldn't pick up on these things. But definitely in the 90s, and certainly in the early 2000s, I began noticing a certain trend. It started with jibes and jabs directed towards men in magazines, articles, and of course, most prominent was the TV sitcom, a kind of Homer-esque, buffoonish portrayal of men as fundamentally incompetent, and the women, their partners, wives, etc., as quite the opposite, very competent. And certainly when I started making videos, and I still remember what incentivized me to do that, that was of course Barbarossa's videos, that trend not only was in full swing, but was also very powerful and very noticeable. People were picking up on it, at least in that small neck of the woods of the internet. But it seems these days as if things have come full circle. It seems that things have accelerated quite a bit. People are no longer content with the jibes and jabs. It's really metamorphosed into something quite different. On the one hand, you have the invisible guy, the quote-unquote incel, the men that nobody notices, save when they commit violent acts, such as this Armenian guy in Canada, or in the case of Elliot Rodgers, well, we all know what he did. And then, of course, they draw attention to themselves, and people talk about the issue for a little bit, and then it dies down, and people move on. But what's really interesting, or has been interesting, in the last few years, is the attack on high-status men. But with high-status men, of course, it can't be the same narrative, or it can't be people that are simply invisible, as is the case with 80% of the male population, approximately. With high-status men, it's, they did something to me. Now, it might be in some cases that some of these men, quote-unquote, did something to these women. Harvey Weinstein seems to be the classic case. He used his power to get women, sometimes not with great success. There is that scene from the hotel where he's essentially whining and begging the female in question. But nonetheless, he was exercising his power relative to his status. You could say the same thing about Cosby and Spacey to a more limited extent. I don't think Spacey is nearly as guilty as people portray him to be. But things have really come full circle with the matter of Brett Kavanaugh and the Supreme Court nomination. Because these other things, yes, it's important. Hollywood executives, famous actors, sure. But when some of these misperceptions and attacks on high-status men enter the political scene properly, not just tangentially, not peripherally, then I think we can make several calls that otherwise would be inappropriate to make. I think things have accelerated a great deal, and I think this is going to get worse and worse and worse. In the case of Brett Kavanaugh, I'm not going to talk too much about the case itself, because that's almost a separate issue, in a sense. He may have engaged in some kind of conduct many winters ago that could be frowned upon. The question is, was it criminal? And what are the bounds of this type of conduct? The other distinct possibility, of course, is that this is all fabricated and made up, at least to a large extent. It seems to be very convenient that the Democrats were able to roll out these women, whom they seem to be weaponizing, in fact. And it's a little bit dubious, I have to say. But when you see these high-status men being attacked without due process, and when you see a potential political man being attacked in a sense, without due process, then you know something is up. It's no longer limited to the magazine articles, the sitcoms with the buffoonish husbands and what have you. And there's some implications here. For one thing, it seems we're regressing in the presumption of innocence. Now, the presumption of innocence is not perfect. It's not the best system. There is no best system. But the presumption of innocence and the general treatment of someone who's accused has been a pretty good one compared to past times. There was a time when all you needed to be was accused by a cleric, and that was GG, you were dead. Trial by ordeal, where you're put through some painful process, such as walking across hot coals, or not sinking to the bottom of some body of water to prove your innocence. I mean, these were the practices of old, and we had, I think, rather wisely done away with them in an effort to improve on the system. People will always get away in an imperfect system. That is, people have committed crimes, but let's be honest, most of us, I think, have the sense to recognize that the Anglo-American system, the system that was developed over several centuries, is better than trying to prove your innocence by sticking your hand in a fire or whatever the insanity might have been at the time. Again, we are regressing in a very real sense due to the insanity of Me Too and due to the general perception that is spread throughout society of men. Conversely, concomitantly, we have women who at the very least are being portrayed as the most fragile of the fragile and creatures that will fall apart at a mere touch or the mere approach of a man. I think this is a bit hyperbolic, don't you? So I'm taking an accelerationist view of things here. I'm taking the view that things are going to get worse and worse and worse for quite some time with respects to men. It used to be, and this is really the critical point that I was trying to highlight before, that if you are a man of high status, you were largely immune to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, in a way that an average man or a below average man might not be immune to the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. And it doesn't even matter if you're very attractive anymore. Note, not too long ago, the actor who's generally regarded as an extreme Chad, Henry Cavill, the guy who formerly played Superman, a debacle in itself. Not that he played Superman, but rather that he's not doing it anymore, because I think he was decent. Well, he made some statements to the effect of, why even bother dealing with women? Not exactly along those lines, but quite similar. And so this is truly a new era, where the mere accusation of somebody is enough to effectively be a pronouncement of guilt, because the effects of such an accusation echo quasi throughout all eternity. If you're a man of any status and you're accused of sexual misconduct or improprietous behavior, well, what do you think is going to happen? It doesn't matter if you're innocent. It doesn't matter if your name is cleared. It is increasingly bearing the taint of something that we have known about for quite some time in the so-called manosphere, and that is the false rape accusation. It's not on the same level, but the accusation of misconduct of some sort definitely leaves a tarnish and taint on your reputation, most likely for the rest of your life. And here's the thing that I find really puzzling, the question that I have to ask myself, and perhaps we could all jointly ask the question, in the case of these high-status prominent men, and that is that in contrast to average men or nobodies, such as myself, or other people that nobody knows about, or nobody cares about, more importantly, what do you do to just live a normal life and conduct your life in a normal fashion if there's always that danger lurking around the corner that some female out there is just going to point her fingers at you and say, you looked at me the wrong way 20 years ago, woe is me, and lo, you must be punished for it. Because it's one thing to go MGTOW as an average guy or just ghost or whatever, to be low profile, to not really be known or observed or seen by society. That's one thing. And for a lot of guys, that is an option if they so choose and if it doesn't bother them, because there are consequences to that too. But if you're somebody like Brett Kavanaugh or a major film producer or a major actor, or take your pick, because I think these days any male is a possible subject to these types of accusations, what do you do about going on with your life? I mean, so all you can do is just go on with your life. We need, for better or worse, quote-unquote powerful high-status men to run the world. That's how the world is run. It is the men in the upper echelons of society that run the world. They don't always do a good job of it, and we can swap them out potentially if we don't think they're doing a good job, but that's how the world works. What do they do when they can be brought low by female peasantry? This is truly a new precedent, I think, in the history of the country. And it isn't just limited to the United States. There was an instance of this a couple of years back in Germany where a meteorologist from a news channel was accused of this. Eventually his name was cleared, but I'm not so sure if he's since found gainful employment. And this is why I take an accelerationist view of this, because it's obvious if you're an average guy, you can quote-unquote go your own way, do your own thing. No one really cares. But with the high-status men, it's not an option. By their very nature, they seek this status. They seek the accolades. They seek to attain power. And what do you do in a situation like that? It's a real question. And I only see this as getting worse, because things have been ramping up now for the better part of 2 decades. Again, it all started with those subtle jabs and jibes, and now we're at a completely new stage where something 30 years ago can be used to ruin your life or your career, even when it's not criminal. He looked at me the wrong way. Imagine if some guy called Mr. Jones was about to be appointed to some powerful political position or a position of influence, and somebody out of the blue comes out and says, No. I saw when he was 9 years old that he swiped a pack of M&Ms from the local corner store. Now, it is true that the store owner forgave him and he committed no actual crime and he conceded his error and he was censured and castigated by his mother and father, but nonetheless, Mr. Jones engaged in malicious and evil intent, and he should not get this appointment because as a 9-year-old, he committed some horrible, heinous crime. Now, I'm not saying necessarily they're perfectly equivalent, but we are moving in that direction. I can see some unfortunate future where some high-status male is accused of gazing at a female in an improprietous way when he was 17 or 18, and this being grounds for a lifetime of alleged sexual misconduct, even though there's no record of it and nobody can produce a record of it. So, in many ways, we're regressing back to the Middle Ages. Well done, Me Too movement. Well done, female kind. Well done, men who have permitted this insanity to go as far as it has. But in this charged atmosphere, and I would never seek to dole out advice to people, as advice is the worst advice, and you certainly don't want my advice of all people, but it is very dangerous these days dealing with female kind. Female kind is very fickle by its nature, and more importantly, it is very fickle under the circumstances. And it really is to their own detriment. You could offer the argument, forgive them, Lord, they know not what they do. But we're at the stage now where it is becoming very, very difficult to have amiable relations with women without worrying about some negative consequence if something goes awry or is misperceived. I mean, this can happen on a date, a second date, a third date, a sexual encounter, a non-sexual encounter, where you're just having coffee. Who knows? It really, really is that insane. Now, before I close out this video, I want to offer some suggestion how we might, I say might, work towards improving the situation. And I've said this for years, what I'm about to say, so it just bears repeating over and over and over again. I think evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology need to be essential learning material in schools, starting from a relatively young age. You don't have to go into the details of sex or whatever if they're too young, but it can be made known that boys and girls are different. They have different proclivities, different interests, and as they age, they will grow greater and greater and greater. Now think about how society would look if everyone, of middling mind at least, were endowed with a fairly robust basis of knowledge as concerns evolutionary psychology and biology, as concerns the very fundaments of what it means to be male and female and how we interact. We would know, for example, that men and women are not natural adversaries, right? We are not enemies of each other, but neither are we perfect partners, as a lot of tradcons like to claim. There is no perfect partnership between men and women. There are times when the interests of men deviate from those of women, and vice versa. And we are now entering a stage, or we have been in a stage for quite some time, where the interests of women, at least nominally, and long term I don't think it favors the interests of women, do not coincide with the interests of men. Okay. If people knew about this stuff from a very early age, and this was basic knowledge in the same way basic arithmetic is, or basic phonics and reading and writing skills are, really basic stuff, I think a lot of this could be prevented because we would understand the psychological proclivities of the sexes, and none of this would be mysterious. And more importantly, overall, we'd be making more progress in society because most of the insanity that we see as it relates to feminism or Me Too or whatever stems from the fact that your average person, your average normie, doesn't know fuck all about human nature, about female nature and male nature, and that men and women are vastly different in their proclivities and vastly different in their needs, all due to the reproductive requirements that have been thrust upon them by untold millennia of development, and even prior to that, millions of years of mammalian life. But unfortunately, we're nowhere near that stage, so this is going to continue for quite some time. I'm just suggesting that we introduce that in schools and the educational system to act as a buffer for the future. Do I think it's going to happen? Probably not. So all I can say is, men, brace yourselves. This is the quickening. This is the time when the immortals gather and they engage in single combat in an effort to slay the other and sever his head, all in an effort to attain the prize. Now, I wonder what the prize is in this instance of the quickening. In the Highlander series, it was never highlighted. It was never told exactly what the prize was. It was just something that everyone always fought over. And so it's not very clear in this case what the prize is, other than bringing the whole system down and ruining what effectively was thousands of years of human progress, be it in the judicial sense, a sense of civilized conduct, or otherwise acting in a even remotely sane manner. Nothing that's been happening with Brett Kavanaugh or any of these cases, or most of these cases, has any semblance whatsoever to what one might deem as sanity. Anyway, enough on that. There will be more to come, hopefully, if I'm still alive. Until then, enjoy your week, and do be careful, as I said. Do be careful. God's watch over you.
If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.